It's Berlin briefing time. Was it Russia? Did Russia send a drone laden with Semtex explosives to attack a Ukrainian transport plane at Leipzig Airport here in Germany? It's a key hub for Germany and especially for supplies being flown into Ukraine. The German government won't use the R word for Russia in connection with that forged attack, but it increasingly is sounding like a not yet. Today, we analyze the facts that have been established and the patterns of the missing information. And we ask, is Germany already knee-deep in a hybrid war? And what can and should we read into the awkward diplomatic silence on Russia? I have three very different perspectives to get us all briefed up on that today. Down the line in New York is Hans-Jakob Schindler, Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. And with me in the studio is Juri Smirnova. She closely monitors and analyzes how authoritarian state actors leverage digital technologies and manipulate public debates. And our very own Moscow bureau chief, who's been working out of Riga, Latvia, after Deutsche Welle was essentially thrown out of Russia in 2022, is also with me here in the studio. We start in New York. Hans-Jakob Schindler. When we look and piece together what we know about those drones that were found at Leipzig Airport, what does that tell you about the threat that Germany is facing? And what does it tell you about who the perpetrator was?
Now, the origin of this, everyone assumes it is Russia, so do I. There is a very interesting apparent connections between the DNA found on this particular drone and DNA found on a packet that was sent to the DHL distribution center, also at Leipzig Airport in 2024. And that links the case to a group of individuals who are currently standing trial in Vilnius in the Baltics. And those individuals, at least the prosecutor in Vilnius argues, have contacts to the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. That could be a clear link, that there is a clear link to Russia if it's proven in the court that they indeed have GRU connections.
So a lot of speculation, some facts on the table. And I did put this question to Alexander Dobrindt, the Interior Minister, at a press conference here in Berlin less than 24 hours ago. Let's just take a listen to that.
Minister, you just spoke about a daily hybrid war being conducted against Germany. 1 week after Leipzig, with more drones having been spotted, many are asking,
was it Russia?
It is apparent that there are attempts to influence German politics and society. Here it depends on the individual case and on whether there's a connection to the upcoming regional elections. I'd say that we all have a pretty good sense that such disinformation attempts take place, especially in connection with such regional elections. Therefore, we must assume that they too are a target of our adversaries. And on what you were asking and trying to find out from me at the end, here I ask for your understanding that we are currently right in the middle of establishing the facts. We are at the investigation stage, and it would not be appropriate for a federal minister to prematurely comment on this.
So a very cautious Interior Minister here, Juri. You are based in Latvia. You are basically at the source when it comes to potential speculation about the involvement of Russia. Would there be such a cautious approach in any of the Baltic states?
Oh, no. In the Baltic states, this debate is very, very heated, I would say, very intense. When it comes to Russia's hybrid warfare against Europe, the Baltic states, all three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, have been talking about this for years, even much longer before of the rest of Europe. Why? Because of the history and because of the map. The history, 50 years Soviet occupation, lots of experience with Russia, with the Russian occupation. And if you look at the map, Latvia, where our office is based in Riga, shares a 456 kilometers long border with Belarus and Russia. Belarus is the closest ally of Russia. Also Lithuania has also a border with Russia, and Belarus and Estonia with Russia. So all three Baltic countries feel physically this threat much closer than Germany. That is the first reason. Now let's talk about drones. In recent months, military drones entered the airspace of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, of all three Baltic countries, dozens of them. Several times, and they had alerts, sometimes several times a day, especially in May and June. Both Estonia and Latvia shot down those drones, but in Latvia, 2 drones couldn't be intercepted by the air defense and crashed in the middle of the city of Rēzekne, in the eastern part of Latvia, in an oil storage tank that was fortunately empty. Investigators say these were Ukrainian drones redirected or diverted by the Russian air defense. At the time, Ukraine was indeed targeting the oil ports of St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga and Primorsk in the Baltic Sea, on the Baltic Sea coast. And Russia then tried to claim that Latvia offered airspace or opened airspace for Ukrainian drones, which Latvia strongly denied. So one disinformation campaign recently from Russia, that was an attempt to spread this rumor. But the drone incident, or those drone incidents, sparked a political crisis in Latvia because local residents weren't warned. The political debate became so heated, so intense, that first the defense minister stepped down, then the prime minister resigned, and within 3 days the whole government took responsibility and stepped down. So one can call it a sign of weakness. The others call it a functioning democracy, when politicians take responsibility and call things by their names.
So this leaves us with not yet established parallels between what we saw at this incident in Leipzig, although we understand that there are certain DNA residues which are similar to the 2024 package that exploded there, and which the intelligence community has associated with Russia. Now, without mentioning the word Russia, there's another thing that Germany's interior minister said at the very same press conference about the overall threat scenario that Germany is facing right now. Let's just take a listen.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing new threats. We are facing a serious threat situation that we are confronted with every day. We are the daily target of hybrid warfare. We are the daily target of espionage, sabotage, cyber attacks and covert actions by foreign powers, aimed at destabilizing Germany, our country, at causing harm to our country, and bringing about political and social change as well.
Julian, this is where I want to bring you in, because Leipzig is at the very least an attempt of sabotage. At the worst, it is a potential actual attack by a foreign actor. We do not know, and NATO so far has simply expressed solidarity both with Germany but with all countries that have seen infringements by any kind of drones of their airspace. Can you draw this together for us? What do you see when you look at Germany right now?
Well, the investigation, as mentioned, is still at the early stages, but there are parallels with previous cases, and the target of the attack, but also the patterns, point strongly towards Russia. And this is not the first incident, not just in Germany, but in other European countries, that Russia is trying to subvert countries, European countries that support Ukraine, particularly NATO countries. In September, there will be several regional elections in Germany, and currently we are seeing disinformation campaigns that Minister Dobrindt had mentioned, targeting 3 regional elections and 1 municipal election in Lower Saxony. And this is remarkable. It's not the first time that Russia is trying to interfere in federal election in Germany, but the first time that this year that regional politicians are targeted by those campaigns. We're seeing numerous fake videos with logos of established media outlets that are spread on social media, trying to discredit candidates from democratic parties, from CDU, SPD, FDP, the Greens. So this is a continuation of Russian strategy to destabilize Germany and to support the far-right party AfD and the BSV, so to support 2 parties that hold pro-Russian positions.
Yes, in fact, all eyes are on that first regional election that we're seeing in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, and the Conservative top candidate there, Sven Schulze, I interviewed and I showed him one of the videos, these fake videos which have logos of established media. Deutsche Welle also has this issue, but it was in this case Der Spiegel, a weekly magazine here in Germany, the most prominent one, basically alleging that him and his wife were embezzling money. Let's just take a listen to his reaction.
First of all, I'm grateful that the media are reporting on this issue and exposing the fact that disinformation is being spread deliberately and demonstrably also from Russia. Images are being manipulated, edited together artificially, and used to influence elections, such as those in Saxony-Anhalt, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, and Berlin. It's an extremely serious issue. Artificial intelligence is making it increasingly difficult, or in some cases impossible, to distinguish between what is real and what is fake. Voices can now be replicated relatively easily, and in ways that are almost impossible to detect. They can then be used to generate statements that politicians never actually made. This is an entirely new level of threat. And unfortunately, we are seeing it in this election campaign.
Hans-Jakob Schindler, how much of a hybrid war, how much is the element actually physical attacks like a drone attack, and how important is disinformation becoming?
Well, I mean, hybrid warfare is simply a term for which there is no established definition that everyone accepts where it starts and where it ends. That classically, and Russia uses all of those elements, ranges from pure mis and disinformation to hardcore sabotage, as we see in or have seen in Leipzig right now. Mis and disinformation is, however, something that is not particular to Russia. Russia is potentially stronger in that field and is using it more smarter than other countries. But we've seen mis and disinformation campaigns from the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have seen mis and disinformation campaigns also from China. It's becoming a weapon that is used to really undermine your opponent and weaken your opponent internally by dividing society and really being ideologically eclectic. It really doesn't matter whether it's mis and disinformation on behalf or for the aid of this or that particular party. The point is to create an environment in which the majority of people say nothing can be trusted anymore. So it's a very deliberate strategy not to convince the other side of a particular narrative, but simply to convince the other side there is no truth or established facts that you could trust.
You assess and you monitor a lot of the disinformation. Can you just give us a sense of the scale of the attacks that Germany is seeing?
Yeah, so the scale of disinformation has gone up, particularly since, and it's been going up since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Germany has been the target of Russian disinformation even before, but after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian disinformation became more aggressive. It's trying to be present on all big social media platforms, to establish assets in target countries, and it's using artificial intelligence to produce disinformation at the large scale. It doesn't mean that every single video, every single piece of disinformation is very convincing. In fact, many of the videos that we have seen in the context of regional elections are really low quality. They are in English, so it's not the quality every time, but it's the scale. So it looks like the people behind those campaigns are trying to produce lots of videos in the hope that if maybe one or two videos would go viral, maybe if those videos will be picked up by US influencers from the conspiracy scene, they could interpret this as a success. So,
when you look at German society, what do you make of the level of awareness or alarm here in Germany?
So I would say a lot of things have happened in recently. Also, the German government has taken steps to get better at monitoring disinformation, to exchange information with other partners, with France, with other countries. But compared to the intensity and aggressiveness of the not just disinformation campaigns, but other type of hybrid attacks like cyber attacks, sabotage. What is lacking is the sense of urgency and understanding how serious the situation is. The understanding that the ultimate goal behind disinformation, cyber attacks, low-level agents is to basically to disrupt the peaceful life in the country.
And the instant response here in Germany, Juri, was to double the number of people who are responsible in this drone defense center that was created. That was an instant step that the Interior Minister took. How much is this an issue that is ingrained into the defense and the security DNA of the Baltic states?
Well, may I add first
Sure.
to the disinformation? It's a huge thing here in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia because of the Russian population, Russian-speaking population, or as the authorities call it, put it, people whose mother tongue is Russian at home, who speak Russian at home. So we have got in Latvia a third of the population with Russian language. Then we have in the capital Riga almost the half of the population who speak Russian at home, and they may be more exposed to the Russian propaganda. In Estonia, 25%, also a pretty huge number of Russian speakers. But the approaches in these Baltic countries are very different. While Estonia established a Russian-speaking channel on the public TV with, so to say, the right angle, with objective information, with unbiased journalism. In Latvia, they banned Russian from the public radio and television. There is some on internet, so online, and there are also private radio stations in Russian language. But the approach is different, to ban as much as possible from the public sphere. But I would say that doesn't solve the problem if we just ban the Russian language, because people do speak at home what they speak at home. So we can't force them to speak the other languages. They can't do it. Disinformation is one thing.
It would also violate their human rights. I mean, that's a kind of a bit of a fundamental factor as well.
That's another discussion.
Yes,
absolutely. But I say it's not banned completely. It's banned from the public radio and television, but it's in private sector still existent. And on the streets, of course, yes, everything. Everybody can speak Russian too.
But when we talk about actually preparedness in terms of defense, and also what's called resilience now, the public debate about a real threat. How do you perceive the contrast? Because you traveled between the Baltics and Germany.
Yes, resilience and preparedness are very good words, key words, because this is not a war with missiles and tanks, but a war with sabotage, intimidation, and spreading false information and dividing the society. And so resilience is as much important as the military defense, I would say. Lithuania has stepped up security around infrastructure objects now. The move followed intelligence reports suggesting that Russia may be planning further provocations in the Baltic region, possibly using captured Ukrainian drones. Similar warnings have come from other NATO countries, and since June, the Lithuanian military, for example, has been helping guard important sites, including the LNG terminal in Klaipėda and so on, and put troops, vehicles, and patrol boats. They can be deployed whenever. Now, it is a decree that the Lithuanian defense minister signed. Latvia has taken similar steps, increasing security around critical infrastructure, including a dam near Riga and the country's main underground natural gas storage facility. As for resilience, as for society, people do trainings. There are, we call it zemesardze in Latvian, which is people who are doing these exercises, military exercises, in their free time. Same units.
Reservists, essentially.
Yeah, reservists is something different. So reservists means they
have an obligation to serve, but this is voluntary.
It's voluntary. Thanks.
There you go. Yeah.
Thanks for this word. Voluntary units, voluntary organizations, and trainings. Not to be afraid, and that's a very important thing, because if you ask people on the street, are you afraid of Russians, or afraid of potential Russian attack, they don't want to hear this afraid. They are alert, they are aware of a potential threat, and this awareness is much more existent than in Germany.
So, Hans-Jakob Schindler, I just need to kind of remind everybody that we still don't know. We just still don't have official information on whether Russia actually was involved or is fully behind that attack on Leipzig. But the bigger picture is the Russian threat. We have seen very little reaction coming out of NATO. That's, of course, because the stakes are incredibly high. A reaction would range from Germany wanting to play this down as an incident to, if it was labeled a full attack, it could be a NATO Article 5 issue. It won't come to that. Why won't it?
Well, first of all, NATO cannot preempt the German government, right? It would be weird if NATO would come out with a stronger statement when the German government has not made an official determination. Now, of course, there is some cautiousness on the German government side about linking this to Russia before you really do have clear indications, because of the attack against the Antonov airline, which makes it into a NATO issue. It's not automatically then an Article 5. It's up to the country to decide what it is, but it's certainly immediately a very urgent question whether it's an Article 4 issue, i.e. the consultations that the Polish government, for example, had triggered a couple of times in the past. That makes it then very highly political, and hence the slight hesitation before there is clear indications or something that you could present as a clear indication that it's going Russia. However, I'm living in a country where a couple of days ago already the intelligence services here also published an assessment in the media that in their assessment it's very likely that it's Russia behind that attack.
Yeah, and indeed, Poland and Romania have seen airspace infringements by Russia recently. That has sparked a protest. But how important is it to send a clear message if indeed this is established to be Russia? What's the message that the intelligence community and security community expects from Germany if it is confirmed?
I mean, at a minimum, the instrument of European sanctions, which is an important instrument and has actually did make some impact in Russia. I mean, Russia now talks about European sanctions as the European way of hybrid warfare, is something that I would expect very likely to be triggered by the German government and with very little resistance in the EU, that you essentially try to target people again. Now, other more operative reactions of the German government are simply at the moment legally not possible. And that press conference that you showed from Interior Minister Dobrindt was the press conference where the new legal framework for the German intelligence services was presented, which would include then elements that would allow Germany to react in other more operative ways in cyberspace to an attack such like that. But that is the beginning of the parliamentary process, and then there's going to be very, very likely a constitutional court challenge. So we are about a year away from this being legally possible in Germany. So apart from the usual diplomatic answer, you extradite some, or you PNG, persona non grata, some individuals from the Russian embassy. Possibly this gives water again if the link is established to closing the House of Culture of Russia in Berlin, which has been in the news lately. And European sanctions are the range of reactions that Germany could take and very likely is going to take if there is a final determination that this is indeed Russia.
Since you mentioned it, Russia House is a cultural center. It's labeled as a cultural center by Russia here in the German capital. And there are allegations that it is being used to also launch potential hybrid attacks. It would open a bit of space, a bit of political and diplomatic space to not let the lease continue. And there is a deadline running until early December. But we are still waiting for an official reaction on that. But Julia, I want to bring you in because as Mr. Schindler just rightly mentioned, there is now a draft law on a secret service here in Germany that has more of an ability to act. Not unusual if you look in comparison to the United States, Britain or France, but Germany was lagging behind. That's for historical reasons, because Germany has the Nazi past where police authority was given also to secret services who were basically hunting down people, hunting down Jews, and also the East German legacy of having a domestic intelligence service that is completely spying on most of its own people. So this historic gap to the capabilities of other nations is most likely going to be closed. How necessary is that from your perspective?
Well, particularly in the area of cyber and disinformation, it would allow German services to not just to monitor the campaigns, but also to take steps to stop them. And those kind of steps might be sometimes the most efficient. So, for example, in the case of disinformation campaigns, it might be the most efficient way just to switch off the internet of Russian troll factory on the day of the elections, or to not just to monitor a cyber attack, but to stop it also with cyber means. So it definitely makes sense, particularly in the area of cyber and disinformation.
Germany could then also launch counterattacks, for instance, as well. Juri, I just want to ask you, how much is that an element that the Baltic states, for instance, are actively using? How much of a pushback is there?
Well, pushback is a good keyword. One of the elements of the hybrid warfare is, of course, the irregular migration. As I mentioned, we've got a huge border with Russia and Belarus, which is the closest ally of Russia. And last year, only in Latvia, 12,000 people were stopped by illegally crossing the border from Belarus. In this year, by June this year, 7,500 people were stopped illegally. Western authorities assume or think that Russian state elements and Belarusian state elements are behind this and trying to bring uncertainty in the society. Latvia has become a corridor to Western Europe. Pushbacks is also a very controversial thing because Latvian border guards, they use this, they do it.
Also a human rights issue, of course, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And there is no debate about this. And the Russian house, you mentioned the Russian house, and it's a parallel world. No, it's absolutely unthinkable in Latvia, in the middle of Riga, to have a Russian house and to debate to close or not to close this, because, as I said, even the Russian language was banned.
Very different historical context, yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hans-Jakob, I just want to throw this to you, because you mentioned the US intelligence assessment over Leipzig. What would have to be the next step here out of Germany, and how close is your assessment of how close is Germany to an all-out hybrid war with Russia?
I'm sorry, we are. This is not a question of whether we will be. We have been in an increasingly aggressive way since at least 2014, where it primarily was mis and disinformation and cyber attacks. Since 2022, it was added far more aggressive espionage in Berlin. About, I think, a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, a Russian spy was arrested who very classically built up a network to penetrate the German Defense Ministry. We had at least confirmed one plot to assassinate one CEO of a German arms company. At the moment, there is an investigation against a potential second plot to assassinate another CEO of another arms company. We had false flags operation, if you think about the damage to cars that was done all over Germany, and they tried to pin this on the climate activists. Turns out these were disposable agents doing this. So there's been an increasing aggressive wave of cyber or hybrid operations of all kinds inside cyberspace and offline against Germany. So this is not a question of whether we are at the beginning. This is the question of how far and how aggressive this can get in the future before it stops being hybrid and starts being something else.
So how do you explain that an interior minister mentions that there is indeed this hybrid war going on, that there are daily attacks, and won't connect this with Russia? And do you expect this to change anytime soon?
Well, I mean, first of all, the context. This was the press conference about the intelligence services law, and the hybrid threat towards Germany, as I had already pointed out, is not just Russia. It would be fantastic if it would just be Russia. The second part is the political consequences. So it makes a difference if I say on this program, I very likely think this has been Russia, or if the federal minister of the interior on behalf of the German government says this has been Russia, because that immediately triggers then political consequences. So if it's Russia, what's the reaction? Is this an Article 4 case? Do we need to have the consultation? Was this an attack against Germany, or was this an attack against NATO as such? Was this a specific attack against Antonov Airlines? All of these things have political consequences and then political risk. So if you don't call for consultations, you may look weak. If you call for consultations, but you can't get into agreement within NATO that this was clearly a Russian attack, then NATO looks divided. So it triggers a whole series of very difficult and potentially risky political decisions. And so I'm not really surprised as the government of Germany that the hesitation is still there to really call this out at the moment.
Thank you, Hans-Jakob Schindler, for your analysis of that. And I can just confirm, reporting here in Germany and having spoken to people behind closed doors as well, that the big question is really at which level this will be addressed. And the general expectation seems to be that in a couple of weeks following the summer break here, that there could potentially be a next step that elevates this really to the diplomatic level. So everybody's braced for escalation here. Julia, I just want to conclude with a comment and a prediction from your side. Where is this heading? If you look at, you've been observing the hybrid activities here in Germany and against Germany for a very long time. What is your trend and what is your prediction? What will happen over the next couple of months?
Well, in the last years, the Russian attacks or suspected Russian attacks have become more and more aggressive. Maybe in the first stage, it was the reconnaissance gathering of intelligence, and now the withdrawal in Leipzig we see for the first time, as far as I understand, the drone with military explosive in Europe, far from the border to Ukraine. And disinformation campaigns ahead of regional elections are a clear indicator that those elections are important enough for Russia, because obviously the hope is to induce a larger governmental crisis. So I expect all kind of attacks to escalate, to become more aggressive ahead of the elections, but also after.
And Juri, from the Baltic perspective, because the Baltic countries have been warning for a very long time, have been warning NATO of these threats. Is there a sense of satisfaction that finally this is arriving at the doorstep of the key big nations here within NATO? And what's the expectation? What will then happen?
Well, not satisfaction, but everybody is alert and aware of this, what's happening in Germany as well. The Baltic states have lived with this reality, you're right, for years, and hybrid warfare isn't a theory for them, it's a reality they're confronted with. You can mention the shadow fleet, for example, in the Baltic Sea. Baltic Sea connects all three countries. I've been on patrol with Estonian Navy there, and most recently in April this year, and saw around me 30 old rusty vessels carrying Russian sanctioned oil, waiting because they couldn't dock in St. Petersburg because Ukrainians in that time launched their attacks on St. Petersburg port and into Sluga. So a huge environmental disaster. So there are many ways where this hybrid warfare can be waged. But the message to the rest of Europe is very simple. No country can prepare for every threat, but countries can become more resilient. I mean, in the Baltics, resilience may be proving just as important as military strength, military power. Life goes on, but people are increasingly prepared not to let that pressure change the way that society works.
And those will be your final words of this podcast for this week. Thank you so much for that valuable perspective. And we're dropping links to Juri's excellent reporting, particularly on disinformation, just below if you want a deep dive on that. With that, you're fully briefed up on what we know about that Leipzig attack, and in particular, what kind of debate that has sparked here in Germany. The big question now is how this will play out at the diplomatic level, if and when Germany starts pinning the responsibility to Russia, or potentially it's somewhere else. But we've spoken to a lot of security experts who are pointing in that same direction. Don't forget to check out what else is happening in Germany. The Berlin Briefing newsletter is hopefully already in your inbox. If it isn't, do sign up. You can find the link to that below. And do send us your questions on what you would like us to explore in more depth. With that, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.